Hi. So, hello everyone. I was probably introduced, but just for the sake of clarity, my name is Victoria Ivanova, and I am a curator, writer, and consultant. I live in London, although I work with organizations and institutions internationally. I'm also in the process of doing a practice-based PhD embedded within the Serpentine Gallery's digital team. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, it straddles my pre-PhD practice, but also what we're currently developing with the Serpentine's digital team. Although I won't be part of conversations, unfortunately, that happen on stage and off stage, I do hope that what I'm about to present strikes a chord and is relevant. And also, please feel free to get in touch by email if you have any questions or comments. I'll share my email on the last slide. And since this is meant to be super snappy, let's jump straight into it. So, as you can see from the title of my talk, there are a couple of pretty significant conceptual jumps between the notion of school, lab, and research and development. And these conceptual jumps are obviously not immediately obvious. In fact, this language of technological and scientific innovation might at first sight appear to be foreign and maybe even threatening to the orthodox understanding of art, particularly the manner in which art is understood institutionally, where the final form of art is conceived through object forms and the final destination in presentation of these object forms and related discourses to general audiences. But regardless of how problematic something like R&D, or research and development, may be as a paradigm, something we don't have the time to discuss today, unfortunately, understanding the potential of art through the lens of research and development is productive precisely because it makes us question the aforementioned institutionally naturalized assumptions, forcing us to shift our perspective on the functions that artistic, curatorial, cultural, and institutional practices could have, and opening these functions up to modification and reform. Now, why do that, you might ask? It is somewhat embarrassingly trivial to state that things change. Things change geopolitically, technologically, climatologically, and economically, to name but a few things on the larger plane. But what is less trivial is to say that these wider shifts in turn produce new challenges and pressures on the art field in its seemingly consolidated constellation, which, I would argue, regardless of the seeming consolidation, inevitably transforms. Now, what it means to practice art or produce exhibitions or run art institutions also transforms as these challenges appear. And the least trivial of all is whether these transformations are willed and strategized or forced through the cascading effects of what may seem to be external to art. So what I'm proposing here is perhaps it can be seen as a proactive or maybe even a preemptive stance towards change. And the route that I propose, which crucially I don't claim to be the only route, and certainly part of the success of this particular route hinges on it being one of many. So the proposal here is to strengthen one particular capability of the art field by developing a dedicated set of art institution protocols and operations. And the capability that I am particularly interested in relates to research as an organizational and systemic process in order to produce different quality of intelligence for the art field, as well as models for implementing structural transformation to make the art field more resilient and adaptive, but also crucially, also allowing the art field to become a platform for collaborations that cannot happen in any other field. Now, what are some of the preconditions for the kind of developmental trajectory of the art field that I'm suggesting here? Now, let's do a little thought experiment. So the dominant art institutional model, as I have already hinted at, and the logic that is based on, are the ones that we have inherited from modernity. This is not particularly new. There are many logics that model relies on, many of which have hybridized with more recent developments, such as financialization. But one really fundamental logic that has remained with us is that the art institution is a site for conserving, collecting, and showing object forms as the central outputs of artistic production. Now, these don't have to be discrete material objects any longer. They can be time-based, event-based, ephemeral. But regardless, the object form as a conceptual category and presentation of these as the central function of art institution still reigns supreme in terms of driving institutional strategy. This has far-reaching consequences in terms of how art institutions perceive their role socially. And while collecting, exhibiting, and conserving object forms for the benefit of larger audiences or their founders and investors is not, one function that is not something we want to dispense with, it may be worth considering whether there are other logics on which art institutions can exist, either as completely separate organizational forms or as branches of existing institutions and organizations. Now, I would like to introduce a conceptual tension presented by architectural theorist Keller Easterling between what she calls an object form and an active form, to help us think through the possibility of developing this more multidimensional way of thinking about art forms. An active form is distinguished from the object form by the fact that it focuses on articulating protocols and dispositions that set further processes into action. What is critical is that these processes are not just metaphorical or semantic, the ways that we're used to talk about art objects forms consequentiality, but rather operational. So to say that art institutions can embrace art as an active form, and there are certain examples of institutions that come much closer to this logic already existing, it is to say that redesigning the operational layer of an institution or organization is what allows this processual conception of art to manifest itself. This leads us to the second point, namely that thinking of art as something that has organizational depth allows us to shift from the art institution as a salon for reflection on world affairs to perhaps an unconventional research facility or laboratory of strategically devised laboratory that wouldn't be able to exist anywhere else. So the notion of strategically devised organizational depth and complexity can of course be applied to produce very different types of institutions and organizations, not just laboratories for engaging with emerging issues, such as those around complex technologies. In fact, plurality of focuses is necessary in order for the art field, to become more diverse and thus more capable of dealing with different types of issues, many of which are very context-specific or sensitive to really minute particularities of a certain institution's positioning. So for example, for one institution developing a more nuanced and evolved infrastructure for collaboration with the tech sector might make much more sense because of its history and its positioning than developing an infrastructure for dealing with issues surrounding urban development. Yet in both instances, this greater emphasis on operational rigor and depth allows for the organization not only to survive in a quickly changing world, but to develop leverage and a voice that is audible and has a different kind of societal value than metaphorically interesting object forms. While I hope that I may have convinced some of you that this organizational thinking is something we need to take more seriously in developing art institutions, I imagine that there are still some of you who are thinking, what on earth does R&D have to do with the art world? So for me personally, and I hope that many of you would agree, developing the possibilities for research and development in the art field isn't about importing a similarly trendy concepts such as R&D into the art field. Although ironically, of course, it's not at all trendy within the policy sectors. I mean, within some policy sectors it is, but it is also a little bit passé to a certain extent within policy sectors. Instead, I think it is possible to develop an entirely novel and unexpected model for research and development through the art field, because in fact, we could argue that's what some art has always been doing, constructing unconventional epistemologies and conceptual approaches. It just so happened that we had come to see the object form as the endpoint of that investigation, and that vision became firmly encoded into institutional practice. But there's no reason why that has to remain the case forever. In fact, if more institutions, organizations were to experiment with their operations in order to offer art to find its multiple active forms, we could be on the brink of a major paradigm shift. Now, what could all of this mean in practice? Here's a very general example of the shifts as they could play out and manifest themselves in practice. It is a very rough and general sketch, and it is not meant to be prescriptive. However, I think it is as important to sketch out the kind of steps that such a vision as the one I have outlined would entail, as it is to argue for the necessity of that vision. Firstly, and this is hardly revolutionary, programming, art institutional programming, needs to be understood more as a form of strategizing. In effect, that's what happens anyway. Yet institutions and curators are rarely fully conscious of the parameters that dictate their strategic priorities. Or equally, they're frustrated about the imposition of external priorities and parameters. What I'm proposing here is to use programming as a means to redefining the very parameters by which strategic priorities are set. So for example, we don't really talk enough about how the notion of risk and risk-taking enters into choices around programming and has come to define so many of the strategic priorities within institutional practice. Just like many other sectors that have been affected by financialization, yet crucially apart from the financial sector where high risks yield high returns, art institutional programming has generally become more risk averse. The reasons for that are too complex to go into presently, but suffice to say that funding models and the market structure for art have a lot to do with that. Yet programming, if conceived as a portfolio of activities and propositions, offers ways to think more creatively about risk distribution and to reintroduce what was traditionally understood as experimentation into the mainstream. Finally, if developed with rigor, programming is a fantastic tool for gathering unique intelligence on a certain topic. I think that's the reason why a lot of people have decided to become curators. I, however, do think that we're entering an age where even cross-disciplinary needs to become more specialized and to have longer timelines, at least methodologically speaking. So we need to get out of this kind of incessant project thinking around programming. So secondly, I'm often asked what would happen to exhibition making as a central practice in the sort of art institution that I'm arguing for. And I think it is really important to emphasize that there is a lot of value in historical continuity of certain formats, such as exhibition making, but equally, we need to become much smarter about how these inherited formats operate and what processes they in fact trigger in the larger societal context, and not just through curatorial statements and their wishful thinking. There isn't really a ready-made template for how to think more multidimensionally about an exhibition, because once again, the context is
can't search the web on Apple Watch.
Sorry about that. So there's no template for how to think more multidimensionally about exhibition making, because context is once again really crucial. But it is possible to think of exhibition making as prototyping and an iterative tool for constructing a knowledge base in a systematic and directed but speculative manner. Finally, while growing a richer and more multifaceted intelligence or unique knowledge base is important, it can't be done in isolation or from a position of moral superiority to other fields, something that the art field is quite famous for. So what this proposal does imply is that art institutions need solid and long-term partnerships and collaborations with other fields in order to not end up generating heaps of hyped-up rubbish. That does imply a fundamental cultural shift, not just in the way that art institutions are seen by other fields, but how art institutions see themselves. Rather than seeing themselves as the recipients of funding from liquidity-generating sectors in order to produce object-form art and keep the institutional base for that logic of production running, but rather they need to see themselves as conversation partners with a unique set of capacities that other sectors can benefit from. This does mean entering into entanglements that raise very difficult questions about autonomy and complicity. However, I'd argue that unlike the strictly critical conversations that surround these same problems in the current financialized paradigm of contemporary art, The model that I'm proposing is generative and prioritizes moving forwards. So I will leave on this quietly pragmatic, but equally quietly optimistic note. Wish you all a wonderful and generative time at the Dubai Art Forum, and I do hope that we'll be able to follow up either by email or in person. Thank you very much for your attention.